November 8, 1942. Sidi Farik Beach, Algeria. The first American infantry units waded ashore during Operation Torch, carrying with them a weapon that very few of them had ever seen before. Packed inside crates marked secret were 5,000 new M1 rocket launchers, soon to be known simply as the Bazooka. To most of the men, these were nothing more than mysterious steel tubes. They had received no instructions, no training, and no idea that this crude-looking contraption would rewrite the mathematics of armored warfare. The Mediterranean surf crashed against their boots as soldiers hauled the wooden containers onto North African sand. Inside each crate lay sections of tubular steel, wiring assemblies, and compact rockets wrapped in oiled paper. The markings warned against unauthorized opening. Guards had been posted during the Atlantic crossing to prevent tampering. Even the officers transporting them knew little beyond vague assurances that these devices represented a breakthrough in anti-tank capability. In less than 2 years, this weapon would force the German army to reorganize its armored tactics completely, spark desperate efforts to reverse-engineer the design, and transform the ordinary American infantryman from tank victim into tank hunter. But on that morning in Algeria, uncertainty hung thick. The Wehrmacht had proven its panzers nearly unstoppable across Europe and Russia. American infantry carried rifles excellent for engaging soldiers, but worthless against steel plate. Anti-tank guns existed, but they were heavy, required crews, and took precious minutes to deploy. The bazooka changed everything. Yet the soldiers prying open those crates under hostile skies had no way of knowing. Some joked nervously about the odd tubes. Others worried they'd been sent defective equipment. A few whispered that the weapons looked homemade, cobbled together in some desperate factory. They weren't entirely wrong. The story of this launcher began not in a gleaming research facility, but with scrap metal, improvisation, and a demonstration that nearly failed before it started. While German armored columns prepared their counterattack against the Allied beachhead, American troops fumbled with unfamiliar components. The bazooka's simplicity would prove its greatest strength, but first, these men had to survive long enough to learn how to use it. The story of the bazooka begins months earlier at Aberdeen Proving Ground, Maryland on May 6, 1942. Colonel Leslie Skinner and Lieutenant Edward Ewell had been ordered to demonstrate potential anti-tank weapons to a panel of skeptical generals. The pressure was immense. American forces needed something to counter German armor, and they needed it immediately. While the British were developing heavy spigot mortars weighing over 100 pounds and requiring trained crews, Ewell had something far simpler. That very morning, he assembled a prototype from scrap. He found a steel tube in a junk pile that happened to be the right diameter, bent a wire coat hanger into crude sights, and taped it together. The entire construction took less than an hour. It looked like something a mechanic might discard, not a weapon that would change warfare. The generals barely glanced at it, focusing instead on the complicated mortars they had pinned their hopes on. These British-designed weapons represented months of careful engineering, precision manufacturing, and substantial investment. By comparison, Ewell's contraption seemed laughable. One officer muttered that it resembled plumbing supplies rather than military hardware. When the test began, 5 of the spigot mortars fired at a moving M3 Stuart tank from 150 yards. The weapons thundered, their crews straining under the weight and complexity of operation. None hit the target. The mortars were too heavy, too clumsy, and too complex for practical battlefield use. Dust settled over the proving ground as disappointed generals consulted their notes. Then Ewell stepped forward with his homemade launcher. Fearing the back blast might be dangerous, he wore a welder's mask, shouldered the tube, aimed through the coat hanger sights, and squeezed the trigger. The rocket whooshed forward and slammed directly into the tank side. He reloaded in 5 seconds and hit it again. Silence followed, then stunned murmurs. General Barnes, Chief of Research and Engineering, looked at the strange contraption and laughed, saying it looked like the comedian Bob Burns's Bazooka musical instrument. The name stuck. But more importantly, Barnes ordered 5,000 of them into immediate production. A weapon born from desperation was about to become legend. What followed was one of the fastest transitions from prototype to mass production in American military history. General Electric and other contractors began producing 5,000 launchers per month by October 1942. Each one required only 20 pounds of steel, basic welding, and simple electrical components. The manufacturing process was so straightforward that factories could retool existing production lines within weeks. The cost was staggering in its affordability. Just $25 per launcher and $8 per rocket. Compare that to a 37mm anti-tank gun at over $400, or the thousands required for armored vehicles. The bazooka represented America's industrial philosophy distilled to its essence. Produce weapons so cheap and so numerous that the enemy drowns beneath the sheer volume. The weapon itself was elegance through simplicity. A seamless steel tube 54 inches long, weighing only 13 pounds, yet capable of piercing up to 4 inches of armor at 300 yards. No complex machinery, no precision parts that required specialized machinists. Any competent metalworker could produce components. Any soldier could learn to fire it. Captain Franklin Johnson at Fort Benning later reported that a soldier could be trained to use the bazooka effectively in one afternoon. In contrast, it took weeks of training to master the 37mm anti-tank gun. The difference wasn't just time, but philosophy. The anti-tank gun required a crew, a vehicle to tow it, and careful positioning. The bazooka required 2 men who could walk anywhere their squad went. Just 2 infantrymen could carry the bazooka anywhere their squad went. It gave them something they had never had before: confidence against enemy tanks. For the first time, ordinary riflemen didn't have to retreat in terror when armor appeared. They could stand their ground, aim, and destroy machines that cost 100 times what they carried. But in North Africa, during the landings of Operation Torch, things almost ended in disaster. Eisenhower himself discovered the night before the invasion that the men had never even unpacked the new weapons. The bazookas had arrived in sealed crates marked secret, and regulations forbade opening them until combat commenced. No one had thought to question this absurdity until it was nearly too late. The troops were forced to figure them out in the middle of battle, under fire, with no manuals and no training. Soldiers tore open crates on the beach, while German aircraft strafed overhead. Some held the tubes backward. Others couldn't find the firing mechanism. Rockets tumbled out of containers, their propellant charges exposed to sand and saltwater spray. Worse, many rockets had been damaged by saltwater during the voyage across the Atlantic. The 509th Parachute Infantry reported that of their first 20 rockets, only 7 actually worked. Misfires plagued every engagement. Some rockets ignited but failed to leave the tube. Others wobbled erratically downrange, missing targets by dozens of yards. A few exploded prematurely, forcing soldiers to question whether the weapon was more dangerous to them than the enemy. Yet even in this chaotic debut, there were moments of success that hinted at the bazooka's true potential. When the weapons functioned properly, they were devastating. A single hit could disable vehicles the Germans thought invulnerable to infantry fire. Crews abandoned tanks, not from catastrophic damage, but from the psychological terror of being targeted by invisible soldiers with portable artillery. On November 10th, the 1st Armored Division logged its first confirmed kills. 2 French Renault tanks knocked out near Port Lyautey. The engagements were brief, almost anticlimactic. American soldiers concealed in rocky terrain waited until the tanks passed within 100 yards, fired, and watched as the vehicles ground to a halt, smoke pouring from punctured hulls. The weapon worked. When it worked, the Germans, however, would soon experience the bazooka firsthand in circumstances far more revealing. During the Battle of Kasserine Pass in February 1943, elements of Rommel's Afrika Korps overran American positions in a devastating counterattack. Green American troops broke under the assault, abandoning equipment in their retreat. Among the captured material were intact launchers along with a supply of rockets. Within days, they were shipped back to Germany for analysis. German ordnance experts would examine every weld, every wire, every component, searching for the secret behind this crude tube that threatened their armored supremacy. German engineers immediately saw the brilliance in its simplicity. Their technical reports in March 1943 praised its low weight, minimal production needs, and impressive armor penetration. The weapon represented everything German military industry was not: inexpensive, quickly manufactured, and accessible to ordinary soldiers without extensive technical training. They quickly began designing their own version, scaling the warhead up to 88 millimeters for greater punch. By September, the fearsome Raketen Panzerbuchs, the Panzerschreck, entered production. The German copy was heavier, more complex, and required a protective shield for the operator. Even in imitation, they couldn't resist over-engineering. Still, the fact that they copied it at all proved the bazooka's revolutionary impact. Operation Husky, the invasion of Sicily in July 1943, was the bazooka's first real test against German armor. By now, American units had the improved M1A1 model with better rockets and refined firing mechanisms. The saltwater problems had been solved. Training programs had been established. Soldiers arrived in Sicily actually knowing how to use the weapon they carried. At Biscari, paratroopers from the 82nd Airborne achieved a legendary shot that would be recounted in training schools for years. They hit a Tiger tank directly through its driver's vision slit, one of its few weak spots. The rocket punched through the narrow opening and detonated inside, killing the crew instantly. The odds of such a shot were astronomical, yet it happened, proving that even the mighty Tiger was vulnerable. German war diaries admitted that enemy infantry now possessed rocket weapons capable of destroying armor at 100 to 150 meters. This was a bitter acknowledgement for an army that had built its doctrine around armored superiority. The psychological effect rippled through panzer divisions. Tank commanders who once advanced confidently now hesitated, knowing that every building, every hedgerow, every shadow might conceal a soldier with a tube. Colonel James Gavin of the 505th Parachute Infantry wrote that the bazooka had given his men confidence they'd never possessed before. 17 German tanks fell to bazooka fire in Sicily alone. More importantly, tank panic began to disappear from American ranks. As the fighting moved into Italy, the bazooka evolved into a universal tool that soldiers adapted for purposes far beyond its original anti-tank design. They quickly discovered it was just as effective against bunkers, buildings, and fortified positions as it was against tanks. The high-explosive warhead could blast through stone walls, collapse reinforced doorways, and clear enemy strongpoints that would have required artillery or air support. Canadians at Ortona used them to blast holes through stone walls, bypassing deadly streets entirely. The medieval town had become a fortress, every intersection a killing zone covered by German machine guns. Rather than advance down streets, swept by fire, Canadian soldiers simply punched through interior walls, moving from building to building without exposing themselves. The bazooka turned urban warfare from suicidal to survivable. By early 1944, every U.S. infantry battalion carried at least 24 launchers. They had become as standard as the M1 Garand or Browning automatic rifle. Supply chains ensured steady ammunition flow. Replacement tubes arrived regularly. The weapon had proven itself so indispensable that units hoarded extra rockets, knowing they might mean the difference between holding a position and being overrun. German commanders realized their tanks could no longer operate alone. Directives ordered tanks never to advance into towns without infantry support and to avoid buildings within 100 meters unless cleared by ground troops first. The independent armored thrust, the hallmark of blitzkrieg doctrine, had become a death sentence. Every window might hide a bazooka team. Every rubble pile could conceal 2 soldiers with a tube. Crews welded spare track links, sandbags, and even concrete to their hulls in desperate attempts at protection. Photographs from late 1943 show German tanks transformed into makeshift fortresses, festooned with improvised armor that added tons of weight and reduced mobility. The modifications helped marginally against glancing hits, but did nothing against direct strikes. Worse, they slowed the tanks, making them easier targets. By D-Day, thousands of bazooka teams crossed the beaches of Normandy, ready to face the armored counterattacks everyone knew were coming. In the hedgerow country of Normandy, bazookas were indispensable. The Norman bocage presented unique challenges. Ancient earthen berms topped with dense hedgerows created natural fortifications every 100 yards. Each field became a separate battleground. German defenders could hide tanks behind these barriers, waiting for American infantry to stumble into ambush range. American records credit bazookas with destroying 12% of all German tanks lost in the U.S. sector in the 6 weeks after June 6th. This wasn't the work of dedicated tank destroyer battalions or air support, but ordinary infantrymen with portable rockets. The statistics stunned military analysts. A weapon costing $25 was achieving kill rates comparable to purpose-built tank destroyers costing thousands. Cheap, portable, and deadly, they became as standard as the rifle or machine gun. Squad leaders positioned bazooka teams at every advance, knowing that German armor could appear without warning. The weapon's presence changed infantry tactics fundamentally. Units no longer retreated automatically when tanks appeared. They stood their ground, maneuvered for flanking shots, and fought back. The Battle of the Bulge tested them under brutal winter conditions that pushed equipment and men to their limits. Batteries froze solid in the sub-zero temperatures of the Ardennes forest. Propellant charges became unreliable, sometimes igniting sluggishly or not at all. Electrical firing mechanisms failed in the bitter cold. Soldiers discovered that rockets stored in trucks overnight wouldn't fire until thawed. But even so, bazookas destroyed or disabled nearly 90 German armored vehicles during the battle. Soldiers learned to keep rockets warm under their coats, tucked against their bodies during long, freezing nights in foxholes. They waited for the moment to strike, enduring the cold, knowing that one good shot could stop a panther or tiger. One sergeant reported hitting a Panther tank in the engine deck at 75 yards, forcing the crew to abandon it. The tank wasn't destroyed outright, but the rocket had damaged something critical. Smoke poured from the rear grills. Within minutes, the crew bailed out rather than risk burning alive, leaving their multi-ton machine to American forces. The bazooka was so versatile that even pilots adapted it for aerial combat in ways no engineer had ever imagined. Major Charles Carpenter, flying a tiny L-4 Grasshopper observation plane, mounted 6 bazookas under his wings in what seemed like a suicidal experiment. The L-4 was a fabric-covered liaison aircraft designed for artillery spotting, not combat. It was slow, unarmed, and fragile. Over the course of 1944, he destroyed tanks, armored cars, and trucks from the air, earning the nickname Bazooka Charlie. His tactics were simple but terrifying. He would circle high until spotting German armor, then dive at steep angles, fire his rockets, and pull up barely above the treetops. German gunners found him nearly impossible to hit due to his small size and erratic movements. His improvised flying tank killer became the stuff of legend. Soldiers on the ground would cheer when they spotted his distinctive aircraft circling overhead. German tank crews learned to dread the sound of his engine. Several times he landed behind American lines with bullet holes stitching his wings and fuselage, yet he always returned to the sky. His personal score reached 6 tanks confirmed destroyed, along with numerous softer targets. By war's end, America had produced nearly 500,000 bazookas and over 15 million rockets. The numbers were staggering even by American industrial standards. Factories across the nation churned them out alongside aircraft, ships, and ammunition. The production figures dwarfed anything Germany could achieve, even before Allied bombing devastated their industrial base. The cost advantage was staggering and represented a fundamental shift in military economics. For the price of a single Sherman tank at roughly $50,000, The army could purchase 2,000 launchers and 6,000 rockets. German tanks costing tens of thousands of Reichsmarks could be crippled by an $8 rocket fired by a 19-year-old infantryman who trained for an afternoon. Post-war analysis confirmed its impact on armored warfare. 12% of German tanks in the European theater were destroyed by bazookas, but the psychological toll was even greater. German diaries reveal that many tanks were abandoned not after being hit, but simply when bazooka teams were reported nearby. Blitzkrieg, the lightning-fast armored warfare that had terrorized Europe in 1940, had been slowed to a crawl by cheap steel tubes in the hands of ordinary soldiers. The doctrine that swept through Poland, France, and the Low Countries in weeks now ground forward in meters and yards. German tank commanders who once raced ahead of their infantry now crept forward cautiously, never knowing when a concealed soldier might emerge with a launcher. The psychological transformation was complete. Wehrmacht officers who had built careers on aggressive armor tactics now authored defensive memoranda. Tank formations that once operated independently now refused to move without infantry screens. The weapon of blitzkrieg had been neutered not by superior tanks or massive artillery, but by mass-produced simplicity. Beyond World War II, the bazooka's legacy stretched across decades and continents. It saw extensive action in the Pacific, where Marines used white phosphorus rockets to burn Japanese bunkers and caves with horrifying effectiveness. The incendiary rounds created infernos inside fortified positions, forcing defenders out into withering gunfire or suffocating them in place. At Iwo Jima alone, nearly 2,000 rockets were fired during the month-long battle. Marines advancing across the volcanic Ash Island faced an enemy dug into tunnels and caves that resisted conventional explosives. The bazooka's ability to direct high-explosive or incendiary warheads into cave mouths made it invaluable. Entire squads were equipped with multiple launchers specifically for cave-clearing operations. In Korea, the original bazooka struggled against Soviet-built T-34 tanks, whose armor proved thicker than earlier German designs. The 2.36-inch rocket that had been adequate against Panzer III and IV tanks bounced off the T-34's sloped frontal armor. American infantry found themselves once again vulnerable, their confidence weapon suddenly obsolete. But the new 3.5-inch Super Bazooka stopped them cold, restoring confidence in American infantry. The enlarged warhead carried nearly triple the explosive charge and could penetrate significantly thicker armor. Within months of its deployment in 1950, the Super Bazooka had re-established infantry capability against enemy armor. The principle remained sound, only the scale had changed. And from there, the principle spread worldwide across every continent and military force. The Soviet RPG series, the British PIAT, the Swedish Carl Gustaf, all were direct descendants of the bazooka's revolutionary concept. Soviet engineers studied captured bazookas and Panzerschrecks extensively, developing the RPG-2 and later the iconic RPG-7 that would become ubiquitous in conflicts worldwide. The British PIT, though developed independently during the war, shared the same fundamental principle: portable, shoulder-fired anti-tank capability for infantry. Sweden's Carl Gustaf recoilless rifle refined the concept further, offering accuracy and power that exceeded the original bazooka while maintaining the portability that made it effective. From Southeast Asian jungles to Middle Eastern deserts, these weapons became standard infantry equipment for armies large and small. The bazooka's influence extended far beyond American arsenals. The bazooka was more than a weapon. It was a symbol of industrial democracy at wartime. Born from scrap metal and a coat hanger, it could be built in hours, taught in minutes, and carried anywhere. No expensive materials, no precision machinery, no lengthy training programs. Just steel, wire, and the willingness to trust ordinary soldiers with powerful capability. It embodied America's strength, not in complexity, but in mass production, simplicity, and trust in the ordinary soldier. While other nations crafted weapons as mechanical art pieces, America stamped out tools that worked. The philosophy extended beyond the bazooka to Liberty ships, jeeps, and countless other systems that valued quantity and reliability over perfection. German engineers prided themselves on tanks like the Tiger, marvels of craftsmanship, but few in number. Each Tiger represented thousands of man-hours, specialized components, and irreplaceable expertise. They were masterpieces of engineering that Germany could barely produce in dozens per month. The bazooka proved that 1,000 cheap weapons in the hands of citizen soldiers could defeat a handful of technological masterpieces. By the war's end, German armored commanders wrote bitterly that the American rocket launcher had ended the independence of the tank. Armor could no longer roll forward unopposed, trusting in steel plate and firepower to overwhelm resistance. Every hedgerow, every window, every pile of rubble might hide a bazooka team waiting patiently for the perfect shot. And so the mighty blitzkrieg was stopped not by other tanks or massive guns, but by the simplest of weapons wielded by men who had never seen one before November 8, 1942, on the beaches of North Africa. The irony was profound. Germany's most sophisticated military doctrine, refined through campaigns across Europe and tested in the vast expanses of Russia, met its match in a tube that cost less than a soldier's monthly pay. That steel tube, cheap, simple, and devastating, helped bring down the Third Reich one rocket at a time. Not through single dramatic battles, but through accumulated thousands of small engagements where infantrymen stood their ground instead of fleeing, where tank crews hesitated instead of advancing, where the mathematics of armored warfare shifted from German advantage to American inevitability. The bazooka represented a fundamental truth about modern conflict. Technological sophistication means nothing without the industrial capacity to produce it in meaningful numbers. Germany fielded superior tanks in many respects. Thicker armor, more powerful guns, better optics. But they couldn't field enough of them. America fielded adequate tanks in overwhelming numbers and gave every infantryman the means to fight back. This philosophy extended beyond weapons to the entire American war effort. Liberty ships were welded together in weeks, not months. Jeeps rolled off assembly lines by the hundreds of thousands. Ammunition, food, fuel, and equipment flowed in quantities that seemed impossible to Axis planners. The bazooka was simply the most visible symbol of this approach. Good enough, cheap enough, and numerous enough to win. The trust placed in ordinary soldiers was equally revolutionary. German doctrine concentrated advanced weapons in specialist units, panzer divisions, SS formations, elite paratroopers. American doctrine distributed capability widely. Every rifle company had bazookas. Every soldier could potentially destroy a tank. This decentralization of firepower made American forces resilient. Losing elite units didn't cripple the entire army because the capability existed throughout the ranks. Veterans returning home carried more than memories of combat. They carried the knowledge that their nation had trusted them with powerful tools and the freedom to use them effectively. That trust defined the American approach to warfare and democracy alike. The bazooka story came full circle on the battlefields of Europe, where German commanders finally understood what they faced. Not just a weapon, but a philosophy that their nation could never match. American soldiers wielding tubes that cost less than a week's rations were systematically dismantling armor that represented months of precision manufacturing and irreplaceable resources. In the final months of the war, as Allied forces pushed into Germany itself, the bazooka teams led the way through contested streets and shattered towns. Every advance carried the knowledge that German tanks, once invincible symbols of blitzkrieg dominance, could be stopped by two soldiers with steady nerves and a clear shot. The psychological transformation was complete on both sides. For American infantry, the weapon had delivered exactly what Lieutenant Ewell and Colonel Skinner promised that day at Aberdeen Proving Ground: the ability to fight armor on equal terms. The helplessness that paralyzed soldiers when panzers appeared had been replaced with confidence. Not recklessness, but the rational assurance that they possessed the means to defend themselves and strike back effectively. For German forces, the bazooka represented the final proof that American industrial might would overwhelm them regardless of tactical or technological advantages. They could build better tanks, but not enough of them. They could train superior crews, but couldn't protect them from rockets fired by hastily trained teenagers. The mathematics were inexorable and unforgiving. The weapon born from a coat hanger and salvaged steel tube in May 1942 had fundamentally altered the nature of armored warfare by 1945. It democratized anti-tank capability, spreading it from specialized units to ordinary rifle squads. It validated the American industrial philosophy of mass production over precision craftsmanship. And it proved that simple, reliable tools in sufficient quantities could defeat masterpieces of engineering available only in handfuls. November 8, 1942, those confused soldiers on Algerian beaches couldn't have imagined the legacy they carried. But within 3 years, that mysterious steel tube helped bring the Third Reich to its knees, one $8 rocket at a time. Cheap, simple, devastating. The bazooka was Eisenhower's weapon of victory, and Germany never recovered from the shock.